Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. There are numerous instances where Jesus and the Jewish religious leaders came into conflict because he did things on the Sabbath that were deemed unlawful according to Mosaic law or the oral traditions derived from it. In our study today, the first 11 verses of Luke chapter 6, we see two such encounters. One has to do with the disciples picking grain, and one has to do with Jesus healing a man's shriveled hand. Both of these incidents are also recounted in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Later, Luke tells us about two other occasions where the Sabbath controversy comes up. Jesus heals a crippled, deformed woman in chapter 13, and a man with abnormal swelling in chapter 14. The Gospel of John relates two distinct Sabbath stories involving a man who had been paralyzed for 38 years and a man blind from birth. The common thread in all these stories is that Jesus or his disciples were felt to have broken the law on the Sabbath. Therefore, today we'll go over the confrontations with the Pharisees in Luke 6, and we'll take some time to discuss the Sabbath. In the first story, Jesus' disciples help themselves to grain they hand-pick from someone else's yard. Now, this is perfectly legit since provision is made in the Mosaic law for the poor to obtain food in this manner. But it draws the ire of some of the Pharisees because it happens on the Sabbath when no one is supposed to work, and they consider picking grain, even just a little, as harvesting. This is an activity banned according to the law. So the Pharisees raise a fair question. What gives Jesus and his men the right to do what everyone else is prohibited from doing? Jesus responds by going back in history to David before he was king. David and his men broke the law by eating consecrated bread from the tabernacle. As recorded in 1 Samuel 21, the priest Ahimelech allowed this to happen because there was an urgent, compassionate need to supersede the technicalities of the law. David's men were hungry and fleeing from King Saul. The underlying principle here is that it is lawful to do good. Rules and regulations, no matter how detailed, cannot recognize every situation and nuance. The spirit of the law may have to take precedence over the letter, as David, the forerunner of the Messiah, recognized. And Jesus, who is greater than David and is the Messiah, goes on to make what is probably the key statement of our passage today. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Exactly what this means may not be obvious. We'll discuss this in a moment. In the second story, Jesus encounters a man with a shriveled right hand in the synagogue. Again, it is the Sabbath, and again, some religious leaders are present. This time they are scrutinizing Jesus to see if he performs unlawful work, that is healing, on this designated day of rest. But Jesus preemptively confronts them with a question they cannot answer. Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to destroy it? The leaders are in a bind. There's no way they can admit that doing evil and destroying life is in their law. Neither can they admit that what Jesus is about to do, that is, do good by healing the man, is lawful. They were ready to blame Jesus, but the basis for their accusation has been demolished. When he heals the man, their only recourse now is anger, resentment, and retribution. In these two Sabbath stories, we learn something about the nature of the Sabbath and something about the nature of Jesus that we might not have known before. With regard to the Sabbath, it's good to understand what the Jewish observance was and what relevance, if any, it has for us today. The word Sabbath, as well as the observance of it, does not appear in the Bible until Exodus 16, when the Israelites were told they should collect twice as much manna on the sixth day of the week, so that on the seventh day they do not have to pick up manna. Thus they can rest and not do the work of gathering on that seventh day. The Lord, through Moses, described this day as a Sabbath rest, and a holy gift from God to the Israelites. This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Shortly thereafter, God revealed to Moses and the Israelites the 10 Commandments, and the fourth one said, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work." This established the Sabbath as an integral and ongoing part of the religious life of the Israelites. The Israelites took this very seriously. To violate the Sabbath was a capital offense. But as initially established, the Sabbath as a day of rest was not just a command, but a holy gift from God to the Israelites. The nature of the Sabbath blessing is recounted by the prophet Isaiah. "If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find joy in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land." Keeping the Sabbath was meant to bring blessing. God's chosen people kept the Sabbath, more or less, over the subsequent centuries. Sabbath is mentioned throughout the Old Testament, even though Israel was often subject to foreign rule, interfaced with foreign religions, and at times was divided internally and ruled by ungodly leaders. Around the tumultuous time of the Babylonian exile, the prophets often recognized the Sabbath, and after the return, Nehemiah repeatedly mentions the Sabbath as he sought to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. In the period between the Old Testament and the New, there was a resurgence of interest in and commitment to the law. Scribes listed in great detail how one should follow the law, including exactly how one should rest on the Sabbath. There came to be 39 main types of work that were considered unlawful. These included things such as plowing, reaping, and hunting deer. But it also included such simple tasks as tying a knot, untying a knot, sewing more than one stitch, writing more than one letter, or carrying something from one property to another. These activities were eventually expanded into hundreds of prohibitions. Jewish religious leaders added greatly to the details of Sabbath legislation. They sought to ensure proper and careful observance by making certain that people did not even come close to violating it. This substituted human law for divine law. It is clear that by Jesus' day, pious Jews were observing the Sabbath in highly detailed and restrictive fashion. One can imagine how burdensome this all was, and Jesus in Luke 11 blames the experts of the law. The Sabbath had become anything but the delight and joy described by Isaiah. The first Christians were almost entirely Jews, so they initially continued to rest on the seventh day of the week. But the most blessed day in their lives was no longer the Sabbath, but the day of Jesus' resurrection. And this happened on Sunday, the first day of the Jewish week. Thus, Sunday became known as the Lord's Day. With time, the Christian church began viewing Sunday as the proper day to worship. So then, what happened to the Sabbath? It is widely acknowledged that Christians largely abandoned keeping the Sabbath by the mid to late first century. The church had become increasingly Gentile. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Galatians, Colossians, and Romans, seemed to suggest that observing a special day for the Lord is up to personal conviction, and it's not to be mandated by others. The New Testament nowhere equates Sunday or Lord's Day observance with Sabbath keeping, nor does it suggest that the Sabbath is to be treated any differently from other Jewish ceremonial days and rituals, simply because of its presence in the Ten Commandments. Nowhere does the New Testament say that the Christian Lord's Day is equivalent to or a substitute for the Jewish Sabbath. Nowhere in the New Testament does it say that we should rest one day a week. The early church, in fact, prohibited resting on the Sabbath, considering it to be an act of Judaizing. It was not until the 4th century that Emperor Constantine decreed that certain types of work should not be done on Sunday. It was not until the 13th century that Pope Gregory IX officially mandated a Sunday rest. Christians during the Protestant Reformation reversed this idea, implying that Sabbath rest is not to be seen as something you do on a certain day of the week, but as a spiritual renewal that one can experience any day of the week. So the question becomes, does Jesus expect his followers to set aside one day out of every 7 as a day of rest? As Christians, we no longer have the Sabbath, but I would suggest that the concept of a Sabbath rest is still valid and vital, only it's not taking off work on Sundays. What is Sabbath rest? The one place in the New Testament where we find an extended discourse about this is in Hebrews chapter 4. The thrust there is that this is a rest all God's people will enjoy in the future. Now, when a person passes away, we often hear phrases like rest in peace and final resting place. Surely these are comforting things to hear, but for the Christian, there is real substance behind this idea because God has promised us final and lasting peace and rest in Him. And it actually begins with putting our faith in Christ. Sabbath rest is a present reality through faith and obedience to Jesus Christ, a perpetual rest that is entered by faith. Some Christians today look at God resting on the 7th day of creation in Genesis as an ordained pattern for living, meant to be perpetuated forever. Some see the 4th commandment as establishing a morally binding law that applies to all people for all time. But the Bible nowhere states that the 10 Commandments are more permanent than any other portion of the law given by Moses. So, is Sabbath rest, in any sense, a specified day of the week where we stop working? We need to come back full circle to Jesus' premier statement, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, it is doubtful that he is saying that he has the prerogative to make up arbitrary rules and exceptions regarding the Sabbath. Rather, he is saying that he does what the Sabbath was meant to do. He brings rest for the followers of God. He says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." In first century Judaism, rest meant observing the Sabbath. If coming to Jesus provided rest for the whole of life, then it is not surprising that he should come into conflict with regulations that prevented various kinds of work on one specific day out of 7. The 4th commandment itself is fulfilled in him, and therefore need no longer be observed literally. In 2 Corinthians, Paul says the ministry of the Old Covenant is replaced by the ministry of the Spirit. That is to say, what the old institution of Sabbath was supposed to accomplish for God's people, Jesus now accomplishes for God's people. And according to Hebrews, the Old Covenant is obsolete and outdated and will disappear. In Mark, Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. The context suggests that this simply means that God never intended to place the Sabbath in a place of importance above human needs, but intended it as a boon and benefit, not a bondage to man. This is well illustrated by the disciples picking grain and by the healing of the man's shriveled hand, both on the Sabbath. Jesus made it all about mercy and not about rules and forms. Some Christians today feel that we should continue the Sabbath in some literal sense, that is, as a designated weekly time of resting from our work. One argument for this is that both Jesus and Paul kept the Sabbath, but the Bible does not clearly say that. It says that they went to the synagogue on the Sabbath. It seems that they went there to preach because that's where the people would be. The other days of the week, they preached in whatever other locations they found people in. There is no clear statement in the Bible that Jesus kept the Sabbath, but there are numerous times he broke the Sabbath. When people asked him why he keeps doing this, he said, "It's because the Father keeps working and I do what the Father does." Jesus claims identity with God, and since God created the Sabbath, he can define and refine it. Jesus has the authority to interpret the divine intention behind the Sabbath law. He makes the Sabbath subordinate to him and as something given for the benefit of humans. This is essentially what he has done in Luke chapter 6. In the final analysis, observing the Sabbath is a ritual, just like Jewish feasts and other holy days. Such rituals are fulfilled in Christ and do not continue. When Hebrews says there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, we should consider that in context it is referring to the spiritual rest that we experience in Christ and not a day we set aside. The spiritual rest and Sabbath observance is not an earthly rest or place of refuge, but a heavenly rest in the sense of eternal salvation. The Pharisees made the Sabbath an end in itself, but Jesus made it end in himself. When the writer of Hebrews says that a Sabbath rest remains, the word used is sabbatismos. That word occurs nowhere else in the Bible. It is qualitatively different from the words translated Sabbath and rest used everywhere else. The NIV perhaps recognizes this by hyphenating the word, and the NLT doesn't even use Sabbath. It says, "There is a special rest still waiting for the people of God." So why rest on Sundays? There are lots of reasons to set aside a day to rest and worship. I'll suggest a few. It's not because it was done in the Old Testament, nor because it is mandated, nor because it is our tradition, but because we choose to lay aside our earthly endeavors to come before God in a purposeful, regular, and extended way to focus on Him. It is a time of spiritual renewal, of reconnection and reaffirmation. We do this because we cherish sacred moments with God in community, and in so doing, we distinguish ourselves from a secular world and give witness to our faith. No, we don't miss the Sabbath, but we ought not miss His Sabbath rest.